My name is Peter Smerek. I'm a retired supervisory special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The last career I had in the FBI was of a criminal profiler, as in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. When I retired, I joined a company known as the Academy Group, which is the largest corporation of retired FBI agents who were, in fact, criminal profilers for the FBI. We operate out of Manassas, Virginia. We provide police training and other type of training worldwide. We work on cold cases for police departments, threat assessments. We cover just about every realm involving violent and nonviolent crime that a criminal profiler could possibly get involved in. You know, becoming an FBI profiler, in my particular instance, was just being in the right place at the right time. And you never know when you're working a case or having an assignment when it's going to lead into something totally different than you ever expected. And at one point in my career, I was assigned to the FBI laboratory as an expert in forensic photography and as an expert in question document examinations. And I was scheduled to go to Harvard University with a criminal profiler by the name of Ken Lanning. And we were going to put on a joint presentation involving child molesters. He was going to be talking about the behavioral characteristics of these sexual predators, and I was going to be talking about the physical evidence that we need to gather in order to put them away. And so I was going to be talking about the photographic evidence and what we can do with it, and the handwriting as how we can analyze it, and breaking the codes that many of the child molesters will use when they're talking about their conquests. So one of the tips we always gave the police officers is look at cookbooks, look at their recipes, because the recipes may not be germane, they may or not be genuine, they may actually represent children that have been molested. A question which is frequently asked is what makes a criminal profiler in our society? And I do not have a degree in psychology. I do not have a degree in behavioral science. And in fact, most of the criminal profilers employed by the FBI did not have a degree in either one of those fields. The traits that we shared in common, however, was a certain amount of intuition, an ability of solving crimes, and the perseverance to go ahead with this work. What you see on television, as far as shows like Criminal Minds, etc., is not very realistic. And when I teach police officers and college students around the country, I say, look, do not want to become a criminal profiler. You're not going to go out and make arrests. You're not going to be conducting arrest investigations. You're not going to be chasing these guys over buildings trying to apprehend them. You're an analyst. You're trying to get into their minds by analyzing their behavior prior to the commission of a crime, during the commission of the crime, and afterwards, in hopes of coming up with a personality portrait of the type of person who's done this thing. In order to enable the police officers to refocus their investigation into an area that perhaps will be more productive. In the case involving James Mitchell de Bardeleben, a criminal profile was in fact prepared of the type of person committing these crimes. However, the profile was not instrumental in all in solving the case. What I've learned after being in law enforcement for over 24 years is that many times the element of luck plays a major role. And in the early 1980s, the United States Secret Service was conducting a massive investigation on a master counterfeiter, an individual who was nicknamed the Mall, M-A-L-L, passer. And his MO was to travel around the country along the interstates. And he would just pick a town at random to pull off the interstate, go into a shopping mall, pass his counterfeit $20 bills, get maybe $15 to $18 back in legitimate currency, get back in his car, drive to the next town, etc. And in their pattern analysis, which they were conducting, they realized he was about to enter the state of Tennessee and travel that interstate towards Virginia. And so what Secret Service did was notify agents in their Knoxville office and Nashville office, etc., and they started leapfrogging ahead of him, stopping at these shopping centers along the interstate, passing out composite sketches of the type of guy that they're looking for. And as luck would have it, this sketch was given to a number of clerks in a shopping mall in Maryville, Tennessee. And the agent and the police officer were still in the mall. Well, who should show up but James Mitchell de Bardeleben? And he walks into a Waldron's bookstore. The clerk looks at the sketch, she picks up the phone, she calls security. The agent and the police officer are tearing down the corridors just in time to see this guy. He starts running, they corner him, they capture him before he can reach for a gun in his pocket, and so now they have their mall passer identified as James Mitchell de Bardeleben. But it's only after they started doing their crime scene searches is when they began to realize, wait a minute, we're dealing with something much more than just a counterfeiter. We're dealing with somebody that perhaps is really more dangerous when it comes to the safety of women. And that's when Roy Hazelwood and the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was brought into the equation. So it was sheer luck. I know one of the questions Secret Service posed to themselves is how long is it going to take for us to positively identify this guy and capture him? And in reality, if he had not been captured at that particular date, theoretically, he could still be out there today doing what he was doing against women. He was a master criminal. The man only had a high school education, but he had an IQ that was very, very high, to the point that when it came time for his trial, the court allowed him to represent himself as his own attorney. And as one who's been in law enforcement for a long time, we love when that happens. We love when the Ted Bundys of the world want to represent themselves in court as attorneys. And so it worked to our advantage there. But this man studied crime. He read the books on criminal behavior. He read True Detective, official detective magazines to see where other serial rapists and other serial killers made mistakes. He learned about the techniques used by police agencies. And he realized that if he went from town to town committing his crimes and not leaving much evidence behind, the local police would be concentrating their efforts locally looking for him, and he could be hundreds of miles away. So he could have been operating a lot longer if fate had not intervened in his capture. I think when we talk about sexual sadists, the Marquis de Sade perhaps could be the poster boy representing that particular genre. And this man, James Mitchell de Bardeleben, is a modern version of the Marquis de Sade. From the standpoint, when you're dealing with a sexual sadist, is that they will inflict either psychological or physical pain on the victim, not because they enjoy inflicting the pain, but as they enjoy the suffering that the victim is going through. And so when you look at this type of an individual, the question always comes up as to whether or not it's genetics that create these monsters, or whether or not it's the environment that creates these monsters. And I personally believe that it's a combination of both characteristics that come into play here. And what, once again, made him so successful is that he studied law enforcement techniques, he studied criminal behavior of other criminals, and he was sharp enough to avoid capture for a long, long time because of that knowledge. A question's always raised, once again, as to whether or not it's the home environment that creates a sexual sadist or whether it's some genetic malfunction in his mind that creates it. What we do know through the research that we have conducted is that years and years ago when we were, and it wasn't me, but Roy Hazelwood and John Douglas and Bob Ressler were going into the prisons and interviewing serial rapists and serial killers. It seemed like they came from a background in which many of them were either psychologically, physically, or emotionally abused. But early on in their life, starting in their teenage years, they appear to have these fantasies of hurting other people. Now, in many instances, these fantasies may be acted out with prostitutes. And if the prostitute will go along with this S&M type of activity, well, in many cases, it stops right there. He never goes to the next level. If that does no longer satisfy him, then he starts fantasizing about abducting an individual in order to put the fantasies into play. And because fantasies are always perfect, and in reality, life isn't, we find these guys going after more and more victims in order to make the fantasy perfect. And even with James Mitchell de Bartoleben, when he was torturing some of his women, he would have photographs on the bed showing what he did to other victims as sort of a script as to how he wants them to scream or how they want them to behave. And of course, as a sexual sadist, no matter how compliant you are with his demands, he's never going to be satisfied with it. And so the punishment is going to continue and continue and continue. When James Mitchell de Bartoleben was finally apprehended by United States Secret Service, they, of course, prosecuted him for their counterfeiting violations. But as we started identifying victims of his sexual assaults, he then began being taken from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, being tried for these other crimes. I only had to testify against him once, because in other cases, photographs did not play as important a role. He has been convicted of 2 homicides, but in those cases that we know of, the women that we've identified had the misfortune of resembling his mother, who he hated. One of the things that concerned Roy Hazelwood and myself as we were analyzing these photographs is that in some of the pictures, when we see him in bed with his victims, he's got a cable release in his hand, but you see his face. And Roy realized that in those cases, he probably killed those victims because his image, his face is in the pictures. And in those photographs where he concealed his identity, then the victims probably lived. As far as his cooperating with law enforcement, to this day, he refuses to cooperate. As I understand from our few contacts that still maintain liaison with the prison officials, he has been acting like a jailhouse lawyer, helping other convicts file their appeals, etc. He may have made friends with another sadistic serial rapist and killer in prison, and we believe they're probably sharing notes and sharing the fantasies of what they have done. The one thing about prison is that their fantasies never end, and they will be reliving and reliving and reliving what they did to all of these victims until the day they die. Quite frankly, I would love to be able to sit down and talk to him one-on-one. So would Roy Hazelwood, trying to get into his mind as to why he selected certain victims, why he did certain things to certain women and not to other women, in order to get a better understanding of what makes guys like this tick. But I doubt that he's ever going to do it. And in fact, years ago, when one of his children, a young girl, learned that her dad was this horrible, horrible individual, wanted to talk to him in prison. She gets permission to meet with him in prison and came out a shaken woman because she says, I have looked into the face of Satan himself in talking to my own father. One of the questions that always arises is, what can law enforcement do today better than what they did years ago in trying to identify and apprehend these types of predators who are out there? And in reality, law enforcement has made tremendous leaps and bounds over the course of time as far as cooperating with one another, sharing databases. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime has become a clearinghouse for all unsolved homicides, for solved homicides, for missing persons cases in which foul play has been suspected. And a lot of state agencies have their own databases now also. That has helped an awful lot. What has also been a tremendous assistance, of course, is the advent of DNA technology, because now we have a tool that, quite frankly, is much better than criminal profiling will ever be. Criminal profiling is an art. It's not a science. It's never going to be a science. I don't have psychic powers. No real profilers do. But what we can do is perhaps refocus the police investigation into an area that we believe will be more productive as far as identifying the perpetrator. And then it's the hard science guys, the DNA experts in the FBI laboratory and other laboratories, the people in the forensic science community that provide the equipment and the chemicals and the technology to help us collectively do the job correctly. That's going to be effective. I know myself when I teach detectives, homicide detectives around the country in criminal profiling techniques, I always remind them to keep an open mind. You may be going there looking for certain types of physical evidence, but if you find something else there that may help another detective solve another type of crime, for goodness sake, just don't shovel it away. I give Secret Service an awful lot of credit in a de Bartoleben case, because when they found these thousands of photographs of women in various stages of undress and being tortured, they could have very easily thrown it away, saying, wait a minute, we're Secret Service agents, we only have to focus on the crimes that have been committed under our jurisdiction. But they didn't. They alerted the FBI, and as a result, this sexual predator, this very, very evil man, is in jail for the rest of his life. In television world today, the average viewer in a 1-hour program wants to see a beginning, a middle, and they want closure at the end. And in my field of profiling, you can't guarantee a closure. We may know who that individual is in our minds who committed the crime, but unless we have that physical evidence, you know, we're not gonna get that closure. So it's somewhere in TNT's archives, you know, and maybe in future generations, in a time capsule, they'll find the pilot program for this show.